Curious Lloyd.
There's no arguing with someone who believes in some insane conspiracy theory. To believe in one of these things in the first place requires dismissing so many facts and so much common sense that nothing will ever get through. They believe because they want to believe, and will inevitably decide that any evidence you provide against the conspiracy was planted by the conspiracy itself. And if that's the case, why even bother arguing with the conspiracy theorists at all? Because the more you dig in, the more hilarious the theories get. We'd barely see the lizard people ruling us. Surveys say 12 million people think that shape-shifting lizards have taken over the world disguising themselves as world leaders and other figureheads. That's including David Icke, because he also believes that our royal family are shape-shifting lizards. But maybe they are right. Well, it's clearly nonsense. In such a world, all of our world leaders and celebrities would disappear during the cold months, leaving the world in a squishy, often moist hands of us mammals. Lizards aren't warm-blooded, and unless shape-shifting into human form results in internal human biology as well, a lizard person would have to hibernate during the colder months of the year. A communal hibernation too, because that's also something that lizards do. The warmer months wouldn't exactly bring forth their domination either. They'd have to wait until the sun has risen before coming out, and even then, they'd be sluggish until their body temperature kicked into gear. They'd also need to get back home before the sunset for the opposite reason, and they would be seen most days taking their lunch whilst laying on a rock somewhere. And sure, it's a little pointless using things like science and logic to point out how stupid this all is. So think about this. What is even the point of a conspiracy of lizard politicians when we already have ample evidence of the havoc that regular, warm-blooded human politicians can do? Hitler escaping to Argentina would have meant a new world war. Several high-ranking Nazis escaped to Argentina following the end of the war, which has led many to speculate that Hitler did the same. It sounds sort of reasonable. What if the Soviets were closing in, and then Hitler slipped out the side door? Is that so hard to believe? Well, yes, it is hard to believe, because if it was true, it had definitely meant another world war. The main problem is the man himself. Hitler had a bit of an ego. Again, Hitler was famously a control freak, a megalomaniac who distrusted his generals and dictated everything. Remember, this is the man who conceived of a system of government centered on the idea that he was the head of a race of superhumans, which means if Hitler had escaped, there's literally no chance that he would have been happy retiring to some mountainside chalet. So he would have had to start something again. But how? He had no men. Aside from all those other Nazis who absconded to Argentina to take up the life of goat herding and sulking, and of course, he wouldn't have found himself short of support from the local population either. Argentina remained neutral during the war, partially as a result of the high number of German immigrants living there. If Hitler had washed up on their shores and told them that they were the only fighting force remaining to retake the fatherland, he'd have found a few willing listeners. But it was the country's leaders' fascist sympathisers themselves who set up the rat lines that helped so many war criminals escape their shores in the first place. But obviously assuming they were doing this in the hope of gathering scientific and military talent to make the country a superpower on par with the UK, United States and the USSR, rather than an overt commitment to Hitler's ideals. But it certainly displays a leadership structure with moral flexibility that wouldn't be a breeding ground for someone like Hitler. The fact that Argentina didn't try to become a new Aryan superpower, it instead focused its energy on mastering football and coups. That's enough proof that Hitler never made it there. If chemtrails were real, our skies would be full of planes 24/7. According to some very excitable people, every day, governments fly chemical-spewing planes over our heads with the aim of turning us into obedient slaves, disease-ridden test subjects, or just flat-out dicks. These chemical-spewing planes supposedly leave behind visible trails called chemtrails, a word which someone has almost certainly confused with contrails, a very real, very mundane phenomenon when you dump hot wet air from a jet engine into cold dry air. But explain condensation all you want and huff on as many windows as you dare, you're not going to talk any believer out of this one. This isn't about the science to them. But what about the logistics? Because for a plot like this to be effective, it would require trillions of pounds. There's just too much land and air to cover. Spraying everything from high altitude like that isn't exactly the most efficient way to dose a population. Crop dusters fly low for a reason. We know all this from the time the US very definitely drugged people from the sky. So let's start with the simple amount of chemicals required. To cover the country with the same concentration of chemicals that a crop duster squirts out, you'd roughly need 120 billion gallons of the stuff. That's just one dose, and it's already several times more than what all the world oil tankers can carry. Which should also clue you into the second main problem. How many planes would be required? It's something on the order of 4 million 747s, and at 83 million per plane. But you can try fiddle with the numbers if you want. Imagining ultra-concentrated, super potent brain drugs which incapacitate people with but a drop. But that's mostly science fiction, and poses another problem. If a drug is effective with one drop, what happens when someone gets exposed to 2 drops, or 50? These chemicals wouldn't get dispersed evenly, and it's hard to imagine a chemical with an ultra-low effective dose that doesn't also have an ultra-low fatal dose. And in the end, what do our conspirators get for their trillions of pounds? A plot which is utterly ineffective against people indoors. So for the first time ever, Generation Netflix will have done something right. If the Earth was flat or hollow, nothing would be real. The flat Earth and hollow Earth theories are different, obviously. That's what words mean, but there are some similarities between them, in that they both speak to radically different versions of nature of our world, and there isn't anything to immediately disapprove them at eye level, at least. Lurking just in the wings though, is every field of science. A flat or hollow Earth would tear up basically everything we know about gravity, physics, geology, and astronomy. Almost every single aspect of the modern world would have to be an elaborate ruse. If the world was flat, NASA wouldn't have just faked the moon landing. They'd be faking everything they do every day. Physics too has some words to say about the idea. At the moment, there's a gigantic magnetic field protecting the Earth from solar radiation. Without that, we'd be dead. Simple. This magnetic field is generated by the massive molten metals swirling around inside our planet. And if the Earth was flat or hollow, we wouldn't have that. So where's it all coming from? Well, just everything. The seasons, phases of the moon, time zones wouldn't work. We can see satellites with our naked eyes. Surveyors have to correct for the Earth's curvature when measuring large distances, even seismic waves. When we jump up and down, there isn't a hollow sound. And sure, if you're really attached to one of these theories, you can still believe it by claiming that all the evidence is faked and all the scientists laughing and spitting at you were paid to do so. But when you extend that line of reasoning too, it's a logical conclusion. Every conspiracy would cost £1 bajillion and be uncovered in a few years. The problem behind all conspiracy theories is that even if they were true, every single one of these conspiracies would implode on its own. The odds of keeping a secret go down dramatically the more people who know it, which is on the basis on which some researchers created a mathematical equation to predict how long, given the number of people involved, major conspiracies would take to unravel. If big science was making up climate change, for instance, they'd only have 3.5 years before one of their 400,000 employees fessed up. Meanwhile, a vaccines containing poison would have lasted 3 years before the NHS and MHAR herd immunity toward getting arrested ran out. So what about something like 9/11? While researchers didn't calculate the time span for that, from their math, we know that to keep a conspiracy secret for over 5 years, it can't have any more than 2,521 conspirators, and there's a good chance that between all the public services in the world, that many people would have been prepping coffee for the true conspirators. The original equation is based on workers keeping quiet out of loyalty, not because they were paid a big lump sum. So if the conspirators were paying off troublesome individuals, any of the conspiracies I've mentioned in my previous videos would be the biggest employer in recorded history. If you discovered that children's vaccines were being dosed with poison, how big would that check be to have to keep your mouth shut? £1 million or 10 million? It's got to be big enough that you could disappear and live off the rest of your days blocking out the nightmares with alcohol. And now multiply that by the number of people involved. The HM and Revenue and Customs and IRS will hear about that eventually, unless they are all getting paid off too. And then what happens when some guy notices his neighbour who works at the HM and IRS, has a boatload of money, you fairly quickly reach the point where you can't pay off everyone without creating so much inflation that you've effectively paid no one off. It just doesn't work, which raises the question, if conspiracy theories don't work, who's coming up with all these conspiracy theories? Is it the government, to keep us confused and scared and obedient?